Yes, I think that in order to think an alternative global trade architecture or reforms in this trade architecture, we need to think about what is happening now, what countries or trade agreements are doing, what experience we can put emphasis on, we can shed some light on it in order to take from that experiences in order to rethink the trade architecture. One of the things I think is very important is what the BRICS are doing, particularly in their development bank proposal. I think that can be a good element to consider in order to propose alternative mechanism in the trade architecture, the global trade architecture. The development bank to expand the financial pro-development institutions, like the BRICS and other regional blocs are doing. The second one is to think about a trade architecture that excludes ISDS mechanisms from their agreement. Like, for example, the African Free Trade Area is excluding the ISDS, so I think that is a good step, and we should learn from that in order to think alternative regimes in terms of trade relations. The third element would be to rethink and to bring back the old debate about technology transfer measures. I think that the debates that happened during the 1970s, where global south countries were discussing a new international economic order that put, among other elements, the need to establish a multilateral regime focused on technology transfer from multinational enterprises to Latin American or the global south countries. I think that is something quite important, which implies conditionality measures, which implies that foreign direct investment should reinvest part of their profit in R&D in the local territories, should imply environmental laws and so on. That is happening nowadays, not only in very special countries, but the EU is discussing those kind of conditionalities concerning Chinese investments. The US includes certain conditionalities during the government of Biden in the IRA and the CHIP Act. So I think this is something that is already being discussed in the global north, and why not think about global south countries creating an architecture that includes those elements of technology transfer in their agreements. And lastly, and I think this is also quite important, is the intellectual property regime. Nowadays, we should go back to think about patents and intellectual property as intellectual monopolies that reduce the capacity of technological diffusion to the rest of the economies. Most of those patents are focused on northern countries, in the core countries. So I think an urgent thing that we should do is to reconsider the scope and the limits of the patent system. And we have examples. What India and South Africa tried to do in the WTO when they proposed a TRIPS waiver to reduce the patent, in order to exclude certain key elements for fighting COVID, excluded from the patent system, to diffuse those technologies, those vaccines, to the population, is something that we should take as an example. It didn't win. The northern countries were against it, but I think it was an example of what we should do in the future. So I think, in synthesis, a kind of trade reform at the multilateral level that can learn from the experience of trade relations that are happening nowadays should include the example of developmental banks that the BRICS is doing, should include the elements of reforming or excluding the ISDS system from this trade architecture, should include the elements of technology transfer, and lastly, a reform of the intellectual property rights system.